The deputy looked at me for a long moment, really looked at me, and then said quietly, "Sir, what branch?" I told him. He straightened up without even thinking about it. Old habit. I recognized it because I used to do the same thing. My son-in-law was still on the floor behind me, zip-tied at the wrists, making noise about lawyers and lawsuits, and how I was going to regret this. I didn't turn around. I just looked at the deputy and said, "My daughter is in the kitchen. She's going to need someone to sit with her." He nodded and went. That was the night everything changed. But to understand what happened, I need to take you back a few years. Back to when my daughter first brought Adrian home for Thanksgiving dinner. And I shook his hand and smiled and said nothing at all about what I noticed. My name is Ed Callahan. I'm 63 years old, and I live in a house on the edge of Barrie, Ontario, about 100 meters from the water. I retired early, which is what I always say when people ask, and most people don't push further. The ones who know me well enough to push already know the answer. I spent 22 years with JTF-2, Joint Task Force 2, Canadian Special Operations. I won't go into operational details. I sign things that mean I never go into operational details. But I will say this. I spent most of my 40s in places that don't get named in press releases, doing things that don't get entered into any public record. I came home with both my legs, most of my hearing, and a scar on my left forearm that I tell people came from a fishing accident. My wife, Helen, knew the truth. She always knew. She had a gift for that. Helen died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand in a hospice room in Barrie on a Tuesday morning in February, and I thought about all the things I had survived and all the things that had never once scared me. And I understood, really understood, that none of that had anything to do with courage. Courage is going into an MRI scan with your wife and listening to a doctor use words like advanced and palliative, and still being able to drive home without pulling over. That's courage. My daughter Lauren was 29 when her mother died. She flew in from Vancouver, where she'd been working in project management for a construction firm. She stayed for 3 weeks after the funeral, and we barely talked about anything real. We just moved around each other in the house, making tea, watching the water, existing in the same grief without having to explain it. I was grateful for that. Lauren has always understood when silence is enough. She met Adrian 6 months after she moved back to Ontario. She'd taken a position with a firm in Barrie. She wanted to be closer, she said, though she never said closer to what. I think she meant closer to me, but Lauren has never been the type to say something like that directly. Adrian Mercer. He worked in commercial real estate. 34 years old, good-looking in the way that men sometimes are when they know they're good-looking. The kind of handsome that functions as a personality replacement. He drove a leased Audi, talked a great deal about deals he was closing, and had opinions about wine that he shared whether you asked or not. I shook his hand at Thanksgiving and looked at him for exactly as long as I needed to. Lauren was watching my face the way she always watched my face. She'd been doing it since she was small, looking for the signal, the read. I gave her nothing. I smiled. I said the food was wonderful and asked Adrian about the market in Barrie and listened to him talk for 45 minutes. On his way out, he said, "Good to finally meet you, Ed." I said it was good to meet him too. After they left, I washed the dishes and stood at the window looking at the water. Helen used to say that I had a tell, that when I didn't trust someone, I became extremely polite. She said it was the most dangerous version of me, the quiet, agreeable one. She was right. She was right about most things. Lauren called me 3 days later and asked what I thought. I said he seemed like a successful man. She laughed a little, not a happy laugh. "That's not an answer, Dad." "I know," I said. She married him 14 months later. I stood at the front of the church and walked her down the aisle and smiled in every photograph. I danced with her at the reception and told her I loved her and that her mother would have been so proud. I meant all of it. All of it was true. None of it had anything to do with Adrian. The first 2 years were quiet. That's the thing people don't understand about this kind of situation. The first years are always quiet. The control comes in slowly, like water rising. And by the time you notice it, you're already in over your head. and you've forgotten what the shore looked like. Lauren stopped calling as much. When she did call, she sounded measured, like she was choosing her words. She'd always been direct with me. Direct and quick and funny. The kind of woman who says exactly what she thinks and then laughs about it. That version of her started going quiet. She stopped coming to Barry on her own. She and Adrian would visit together, which sounds normal. Sounds like a couple thing. But I noticed that she never disagreed with him in front of me. She used to argue with me about everything. Hockey, politics, which route to take on the highway. That Lauren disappeared. Adrian was always pleasant when they visited. That's important to say. He was courteous and conversational, and he helped clear the table, and he called me Ed, and sometimes brought a decent bottle of red. Nothing you could point to. Nothing a reasonable person could say was wrong. But I watched how Lauren handed him things, how she checked his expression before she finished a sentence, how she laughed just a beat too late at his jokes, like she was monitoring herself. I know surveillance. I know what it looks like when someone is always tracking another person. I know what it looks like when that person is used to being tracked. Helen would have said something by now. Helen would have sat Lauren down in the kitchen and made her tea and asked her straight out. I didn't have that gift. I had other ones. I started driving past their house on Dunlop Street when I was in town for errands. I wasn't following anyone, wasn't doing anything that would hold up in a courtroom. I was just a retired man who sometimes drove slowly through neighborhoods. I saw Lauren once, on a Saturday morning, getting into her car, alone. She looked up and saw me and froze for just a half second before she smiled and waved. That half second told me everything. I called her that night and said I'd been thinking about establishing a family communication system. I told her it was something Helen and I had talked about years ago, that it made sense for two people living separately to have a protocol. Something simple, a word or a phrase that meant I need you to call me back immediately. Something that sounded innocuous in a text but carried weight between us. Lauren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What word?" I said, "Sparrow." Helen's favorite bird, a small bird, easy to overlook. Lauren said, "Okay, Dad." Her voice was very careful. I pretended not to notice. I told her, "If you ever send that word, I come. I don't ask questions. I don't call ahead. I just come. And you don't have to explain anything until you're ready." She said, "I understand." Then she said she had to go. Adrian was calling her for dinner, and she'd talk to me soon. I hung up and sat in Helen's chair by the window and looked at the dark water for a long time. I want to be honest about something. I second-guessed myself constantly during those years. I thought about the fact that I had spent decades in a profession that trained me to see threat patterns, and I thought about how that kind of training can become a liability in civilian life. How you can see danger in ordinary things. How you can mistake a man's ordinary curtness for something more sinister. I am not a therapist. I am not a relationship counselor. I am a man who spent 22 years learning to read rooms and read people and make decisions with incomplete information. And sometimes, that's a problem. So I stayed in my lane. I called Lauren every Sunday. I kept the calls light. I told her about the neighbors, about the lake, about the project I'd started on the back deck. I made it easy for her to call me without it meaning anything, so that when she needed it to mean something, the channel was already open. Their son, Jamie, was born 3 years into the marriage. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, born in the Royal Victoria Regional Health Center on a Thursday in May. I drove down the same day and held him in the hallway outside Lauren's room. Adrian was in there with her, and I looked at this small face and felt something shift in my chest that I don't have a better word for than purpose. Jamie had Lauren's eyes. He had the same look she had as a baby, the look that says I am paying close attention to everything. I started being deliberate about my visits after that. I made sure Lauren knew I was available, not just as a father, but as a person with a spare bedroom and a truck and no questions asked. I fixed things at the house when they visited. I brought things for Jamie. I let Adrian talk about his deals, and I listened and nodded, and I was, by every observable measure, a pleasant and supportive father-in-law, extremely polite. The call came on a Friday evening in October. Last year, Jamie was 2, almost 3. I was in the garage doing something to the snowblower. The kind of mindless mechanical work that I've always found settling. My phone buzzed on the workbench. I looked at the screen. A text from Lauren. It said, "Dad, thanks for the recipe. The sparrow on our feeder this morning reminded me of Mom. Love you." I read it twice. Then I put down the wrench, picked up my keys, and walked to the truck. I didn't call ahead. That was the agreement. I didn't text back. I just drove. It's 34 minutes from my place to their house on Dunlop Street on a clear night. I made it in 28. I don't remember most of the drive. I remember the lights on the highway, and I remember checking the time, and I remember my hands being completely steady on the wheel, which is something that happens to me in certain situations. The body just organizes itself. 22 years of training. The machinery doesn't forget. I pulled up in front of the house and saw Adrian's car in the driveway. The lights were on downstairs. I could hear something from outside, not clearly, but something. A voice raised. I went around the back. The back door was unlocked. Lauren always left the back door unlocked because Adrian locked himself out twice in their first year and made it her problem. I let myself in through the kitchen. Lauren was in the living room. She was standing against the wall near the fireplace, and Adrian was in the middle of the room. And I could see even from the hallway that he'd been drinking. Not just drinking for a while, the specific unsteadiness of someone who started in the afternoon. He had a glass in his hand. He was talking at her in the low, controlled voice that is somehow worse than shouting. And she was very still, the way small animals go still. Jamie was upstairs. I'd made sure of that. The monitor on the kitchen counter was quiet, which meant he was asleep, which was the only piece of luck in the whole evening. Adrian hadn't heard me come in. I walked into the living room. He turned around. For a moment, he just stared. I think he was processing it. Me, in his living room, in my jacket, at 9 o'clock on a Friday. Then he said, "What the hell are you doing here?" I looked at Lauren first. She had her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wet. She was breathing. She was standing. She was okay in the immediate sense of the word. And that was enough for me to take a breath and do the next thing slowly. I said, "Lauren, can you go to the kitchen, please?" She didn't move immediately. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at me her whole life, reading my face, looking for the signal. I made sure she found it. I kept my voice even and my face easy, and I let my eyes say, "It's all right, I have this." She went to the kitchen. Adrian took a step toward me. "She's my wife. You don't get to walk into my house and..." "Adrian," I said, "put the glass down." He stared at me. I want to tell you that I said something sharp, something that would make a good story, a cutting line that summed up 22 years of service and a father's love and the specific fury of watching your daughter be diminished by someone who thought her father was too old and too soft to do anything about it. I want to tell you I said something. I didn't. I said, "Put the glass down." He put the glass down. I think the way I said it was surprising to him. I think he was expecting an old man's voice, careful, accommodating, the voice I'd been using around him for 4 years. He got a different one. He said, "You need to leave my house." I said, "I'm not going to do that." He came at me. I'll give him this. He committed to it. He wasn't tentative. He came across the room with his full weight behind him, fueled by an evening's worth of scotch, and 4 years of believing that nobody in Lauren's family was a real problem. I stepped to the side and used his momentum and put him face down on the hardwood floor in about 2 seconds. Not because I was faster or stronger than a man in his late 30s, because I knew exactly what I was doing and he did not. There's a version of this that involves a lot of muscle and aggression. And then there's the version I learned, which is about geometry and leverage and ending the problem before it gets bigger. I put my knee into the center of his back, held his wrists, and I spoke very clearly into the back of his head. I said, "Stay down." He struggled for about 20 seconds. Then he stopped. I said, "Adrian, I'm going to hold you here until the police arrive, and then you're going to stand up slowly and talk to them. That's what's going to happen next. Do you understand me?" He said something unpleasant about me, about Lauren, about what he was going to do with his lawyers. I said, "Okay." Lauren had called 911 from the kitchen. I could hear her talking, steady and clear, giving the address. I thought, There she is. There's the woman Helen and I raised. The OPP officers were there in 11 minutes, two of them. Both young, one of them barely looked old enough to have the vest. They came in through the front door. Lauren had unlocked for them and stopped when they saw the situation. Me on the floor with Adrian, the glass on the coffee table, Lauren in the kitchen doorway. The older officer said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." I stood up slowly, hands visible, the way you do it, and stepped back. Adrian got up. His face was the color of old brick. He started talking immediately about assault, about breaking and entering, about his lawyers. He was loud and fast and absolutely certain that he was the wronged party in this room. The older officer looked at me. "Sir, can you explain what's happening here?" I explained. Calmly, in the order it happened, without embellishment. When I finished, the officer looked at Adrian, who was still talking, and then back at me. He said, "And your relationship to the homeowner? I'm her father." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Sir, are you current or former military? Law enforcement?" I looked at him. "What makes you ask?" He gave me a small, professional smile. "The way you talk," I said. "Former military, 22 years, JTF2. Both officers went very quiet, not dramatically, just the particular quality of quiet that I've seen in rooms before, when a piece of information changes the geometry. The younger officer, to his credit, didn't say anything at all. He just looked at Adrian with a slightly different expression than before. They arrested Adrian that night. Domestic violence charges. The OPP were thorough, more thorough than I expected. And Lauren gave a statement that went on for 2 hours. I sat in the kitchen with Jamie, who had woken up during the noise and was confused and tired, and not sure why Grandpa was at the house so late. I made him warm milk and sat him on my lap, and we watched the lights of the police cruiser through the window until he fell asleep again. I looked at his face while he slept. He had Lauren's eyes. He had her way of going completely still when he was paying close attention. He was going to be all right. The weeks after that were not simple. I want to be clear about this because in stories like mine, the aftermath always gets compressed. The bad person goes away, everything resolves, the family exhales. The truth is messier and quieter and harder. Adrian's lawyer was expensive and good, which is what happens when the person in question works in commercial real estate and has 4 years of well-managed finances and a mortgage and a professional reputation to protect. There were hearings. There was a period where Lauren was in the house alone with the locks changed and a security system I had installed, and I drove down 3 times in the first week on the pretense of various home repair projects. Lauren let me pretend. That was her gift to me. She also, in the middle of all of it, sat me down at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in November. Jamie was napping. It was gray outside. She made coffee and said, "Dad, tell me about the training." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not asking because I'm angry or because I feel like you kept something from me. I know why you didn't broadcast it. I know you." She paused. "I'm asking because I want to know who my father actually is." So I told her, not everything. Some things I will never say out loud to anyone living. But I told her the shape of it. 22 years, JTF2. The things I had done and seen and survived. The cost of it. Helen's role in making it possible. How she had held everything together at home so I could do what I did. And how she never once complained. Not because she wasn't affected, but because she understood what she'd married. Lauren listened the way her mother used to listen. Completely. No interruptions. When I finished, she said, "I always knew something. I could never name it, but I knew." I said, "The point was never to hide it." She said, "I know." "The point was not to scare people." I said, "Yes." She drank her coffee. Then she said, "Adrian used to say you were harmless." He actually used that word, harmless. She looked out the kitchen window. I never corrected him. I said, "You didn't need to." She looked at me. "Dad, you were in our living room in 11 seconds, 28 minutes, I said. I timed it. She laughed, and it was the old laugh, the real one, the one that sounds like Helen's laugh, quick and genuine with a little disbelief in it. I hadn't heard that laugh in years. It was the best sound I've heard since Helen was alive. The court proceedings took several months. I will not bore you with the legal specifics of the Ontario court process. partly because I am not a lawyer, and partly because every detail of those months belongs to Lauren, not to me. What I will tell you is this. I attended every hearing that I was permitted to attend. I wore my dress uniform to one of them. Not as a stunt, not for effect, but because Lauren asked me to, and when my daughter asks me for something, I try to give it to her. The courtroom was small. There were people I didn't know on the benches. Adrian sat at the defense table in a good suit, looking precisely as composed as his lawyer needed him to look. When I walked in, he looked at me. I looked at him. I sat down next to Lauren, and she reached over without looking at me and put her hand on my arm and left it there. Adrian looked away. I don't know what he saw when he looked at me. I don't know what I look like to other people when I am being still and quiet and very, very present in a room. Helen used to say I looked like a building, solid and large and not going anywhere. I have learned to take that as a compliment. I want to tell you something before I finish, because I think it is the actual point of all of this, and the part that I could not have understood at 30 or 40 or even 50. When Lauren was 12 years old, Helen and I went to her parent-teacher conference, and her teacher told us that Lauren was exceptional, but that she tended to underestimate herself. She said Lauren was the first to doubt her own read on a situation, that she needed external confirmation before she trusted her own judgment. I remembered that on the night in October when I walked into the living room and saw my daughter standing against the wall. She had known. She had known for years, probably, that something was wrong. Her read was right. It was always right. What she needed, what took her years to find, was the belief that her judgment was worth acting on, that the thing she knew was real enough to ask for help. The sparrow text was the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. I say that as a man who has seen genuine bravery in very hard places. That text, sent from inside her own house while Adrian was in the next room, that was Lauren deciding that what she knew was real. I made sure I was ready when she decided. That is the only thing I did right in this whole situation. I stayed ready. I stayed available. I made it easy to call me without it meaning anything, so that when it needed to mean everything, the line was already open. If you are a parent reading this or listening, that's the only advice I have. You cannot protect your children from everything. You cannot see into their marriages. You cannot live their lives for them, and you should not try. But you can make it easy to call you. You can answer when they do. That's it. That's all of it. Lauren and Jamie live in the house on Dunlop Street with new locks and her name alone on the title now. I drive down on Sundays. I take Jamie to the YMCA when the weather's bad and to the waterfront trail when it's good. He's 3.5, and he runs ahead of me on the path and turns around every 10 seconds to check that I'm still there. I'm always still there. Helen would have liked that. She would have said something dry and precise about it, something that would have made me laugh. And then she would have put her hand in my arm the way Lauren does now. The sparrow was her favorite bird. Small, easy to overlook, quietly everywhere. She was right about that too.